Intro to systems theory and cybernetics. Yeah, get us going.
I mean, how much of a dork do you have to actually be to have clicked on a podcast about systems theory and cybernetics?
You must be bored. It's pandemic times, so what else are you gonna do, right? Come to Plastic Pills.
I mean, we're even worse. How much of a dork do you have to be to record a podcast on systems theory?
Oh God, I don't know if I would be doing any of this if I wasn't trying to incorporate it into my dissertation.
This is your first two-man podcast, Eric. How does that feel?
I'm a little bit on edge. I'm excited. I'm sweaty. I'm nervous. I'm having a beer. All these different emotions.
I love the emotion of beer.
That's my favorite state of consciousness.
Today, it's a systems theory spit roast. Victor and Matt did some bonus episodes about politics and rights and boring shit like that. So Eric and I felt that we had to one-up them in the PillPod civil war. And we hope to accomplish that by making a whole series, a weekly or bi-weekly series.
Yeah, I was just saying before that if we can be at least as interesting, if not more so, than Victor and Matt, then we will have done our jobs. And we'll still keep our regular format of all of us coming together for the main show, but we're branching off a bit into these microdoses and two-man pods.
Yeah, and if you feel that we've accomplished that goal, feel free to remind Matt and Victor on Twitter. That'd be great.
Yep.
Speaking of bi-weekly, I'm looking at this word that I've written down, and does that mean twice a week or every 2 weeks? Because I meant the latter.
I would understand it as maybe once every other week. Bi-weekly? It could mean twice a week. Biannual, quarterly. Quarterly means 4 times a year.
Not semi-weekly. So the Pill Pod is always unscripted. It will probably be forever unscripted because that's the kind of chill environment we're looking for, and the kind of podcasts that I would listen to if I weren't editing them all the time. However, it doesn't mean we can't plan, and that's what this is. It's a planned series. So the series topic, as we've said, is systems theory and cybernetics, which is a method, one that both Eric and I endorse, actually. It's better than Marxism, too.
Absolutely.
As we hope to prove.
Yeah, but it might also be interesting to explore perhaps ways that they could work together, the old Marxists with new sort of cybernetics point of view. There is things online like cyber socialism and cybernetic Marxism. I don't know much about that yet, but I got my eye on it.
Cybernetic Marxism could work also.
The cyber socialists are more about online sharing of free access to knowledge and information, data sharing, kind of not they'd be against the whole like sort of structure of paywalling information in journals like JSTOR and ProQuest and Academia One and all that shit. That would be anti-cyber socialist. That's cyber capitalist.
I should say that the cyber prefix here is not the same prefix as whatever cyber means when it involves cyberspace or cyber socialism in the sense that you brought up. The cyber in cybernetics comes from the Greek word kybernatao, and I don't know how to pronounce that properly, but it means steersman.
Yeah.
Well, kybernatao is the verb, and kyberneticos, I think, is the steersman. And we know that Louise is going to correct us if we're wrong about that. So
yeah, we got some Greek studying patrons that'll probably get on us up for our shitty pronunciations. We have cyber. That's all we need to get right. We're Anglophones. The Kubernetes, gubernator stuff is Greek and Latin. It's cool stuff, but it's part of the
gubernator is connected. If you speak of perhaps a gubernatorial election, it's the same root as Kubvernau.
So when you call Arnold Schwarzenegger the governor, back when he was that of California. You're actually pronouncing it kind of close to the way it was in Latin before it got into English as governor.
So systems theory and cybernetics, in the sense that we're using it, are two things that I never heard of really until I heard of them, which is obviously tautological, but I never even heard people talk about them in the way that we talk about it until I encountered it in an academic environment, or an upper level academic environment, I should say. But Eric's main area of study is semiotics, as we'll soon impart, though systems theory can be applied to language and communication as well as to consciousness. It was originally a biological concept. And then I think where our main area of focus is probably going to end up is in sociology. So it's more of a method that crosses disciplines.
And if you're a fan of smashing words together, that's socio-cybernetics, which is out there. You can search it and you'll find things. Probably Nicholas Lumen, but probably other stuff as well. Maybe some Stafford Beer with the sociological approach. But that's name dropping. I would go back and contest, when you hear the word cyber, you can totally think of things like cyberspace and cyberpunk and things like that, because it's cool, it's aesthetically, it's the shit. Cyberspace was coined by William Gibson, who wrote Neuromancer, which basically launched an entire genre of literature, where the Matrix also comes from this idea, right, of cyberspace and the Matrix, the machine world, right? So I would definitely endorse jumping to all of these associations when you hear the word cyber, especially in literature and art and movies and cool shit like Blade Runner, right? That's like cyberpunk. I would bring all that in there because it's machines, it's computers, it's cyborgs, cybernetic organisms. Like, this is the shit when it comes to pop culture. But it can get very dry, and we may stay away from some of the more technical points that come out of cybernetics because it was developed by a group of mathematicians and neuroscientists whose general lingo goes way over my fucking head. But it is cool shit nevertheless. And it is trickled down to us in various forms, in sociology, as we said, and in philosophy, and some of the stuff that we do focus on in our, your former PhD and my current PhD.
So, yeah, cyber, I think it makes the jump with the word cyborg, which, as you said, is short for cybernetic organism. But as we wish to prove here, all organisms are cybernetic. And that's not in a Haraway sense either. They're, according to the definition of cybernetics in the technical way that we're going to be using it, all organisms are cybernetic, as well as some machines.
I think Haraway was kind of plugged into this, but I actually went through her book today and I didn't really find any references to the big cybernetic thinkers. So she's kind of coming at cyborg from maybe a bit of a different angle than cybernetics. She was trained in biology, so she must have known about someone we're going to be talking about, Maturana and Varela, who coined Autopoiesis. They were biologists who took a cybernetic approach to biology. But yeah, generally, probably Haraway will be left out of this story. And maybe you can breathe a sigh of relief.
I don't know this, but maybe you know this. I believe it's autopoiesis because there's an extra iota in there. And I don't know if it's the same word as poiesis, as in poetics. Another thing that we actually should ask our patron who speaks Greek. Anyway, this is a little bit getting ahead of ourselves, so...
Not gonna lie, it does get me slightly hard to think about cybernetics and Heidegger. I mean, I have not gone there, but poiesis, autopoiesis. There's a connection there that would really get me.
I pronounce it poiesis, but as I've mentioned before, I do not pronounce any Greek, ancient or modern. Anyway, listener, what you have to look forward to here is we're going to just do an intro today, discuss what systems theory is in general, what cybernetics is. They're not exactly the same thing, by the way. They overlap. But we hold this view, the two of us, versus our other two compatriots on the pill pod who are more into, I guess, liberal humanism or liberal socialism. And that really doesn't, the two are at loggerheads. You can't really maintain both systems at once. So maybe we'll have to bring our information that we find here and go back and challenge them with it.
Yeah, you can find the social democrats. I think they're self-described social democrats, but they're coming from political theory. So we'll have to do a little bit of work, I think, to bring cybernetics to politics. So we may be at a slight disadvantage comparing. There's no cybernetic party out there yet. Maybe there will be soon. Who knows? The cyborg socialists. I don't know. But unfortunately, no, I don't think political science has picked up on this. Not in the mainstream.
Although you can use systems theory to describe political systems. For example, how in principle, a country that has open elections always seems to channel into basically a two-party system very often. Sometimes there's a third, but often.
Yeah. And it's really helpful to know about the distinctions between the judicial and the legislative and the executive branches of government, because I think that if you're into cybernetics, you would make that distinction too and call those sort of separate systems that exhibit a kind of what we're going to describe as organizational closure.
Right. So I think what people are probably confused because we've just mentioned pretty much every discipline of sociology and biology. And the reason for that is that systems theory is a method rather than like a school. So you can take the method and apply it to any systems. That's why it's called systems theory, sometimes general systems theory. And the generality of systems theory is that it can be applied to any system that reproduces the conditions for its own continuation through time.
Yes, and cybernetics is interdisciplinary, which is why we're all over the place a little bit. It is the anti-disciplinary in some ways. It was born in interdisciplinarity, and its name came around in the end of the 1940s, right, with Norbert Wiener's book from 1948 called Cybernetics, or The Study of Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine. So it was born in this interdisciplinary environment, and it kind of encompasses a lot of different, let's say, it does encompass a load of disciplines, but it is sort of not transdisciplinary maybe. All those words just mean that it's not rooted in any single discipline. It's not English, it's not history, it's not philosophy, but it is all those things.
Right, it's closely associated to theories of consciousness, in some cases. Information theory was especially important at the beginning. If we're talking about Claude Shannon or Weaver, this kind of information theory that studies how information can be measured. Early comp sci, von Neumann was involved with the development of systems theories thinking, or system theory thinking. So we're going to lay the groundwork here, kind of discuss what we're going to discuss bi-weekly. And those episodes will be on the Patreon if you're interested in this stuff. Maybe not all, depending on our release schedule. But this will be in addition to our regular free content.
Yes, sir. So
buy us a beer because we put a lot of research hours into this.
Yeah, preferably craft beer.
Canadian craft also. We don't want no Anheuser-Busch craft. All right. So with that said, I mean, we're going organically. I have some point form notes in front of me. So if this sounds all good to you, one thing I did want to mention to you, you're usually not the culprit of this, but we have a general rule on the Pill Pod that is no name dropping and no concept dropping without explaining it. Although you're not the culprit, I just wanted to reinstate that rule because this is something that I'm sure some people are hearing for the first time. It's not widely used.
Yeah. Don't worry, I've already caught myself doing that. I've already dropped too many names we're going to need like 6 episodes now just to explain those names. But we could name drop Plato, since he's kind of the one where the term first appears. So hopefully everybody knows that. Plato used it, actually, he used it to refer to government, efficient government, right? Because you remember that cybernetics refers to steersmen, like someone who would steer a boat. They would be at the back of the boat, they would have their rudder or whatever, and the sea would be crashing against the boat, and they would like lock their eyes on their target, right? Like they're going across the Mediterranean, they don't have compasses. This isn't modern navigation. The guy's just sort of trying to keep the boat steady and pointed towards where he wants to go. And the boat goes along. The goal is to reach the destination, and he's controlling the system. He doesn't have control of the system. So don't confuse this idea of control with like sort of maybe an image of like Nazis or any kind of coercive control. This is a control in the regulative sense, where there are forces crashing against your metaphorical boat, which your boat could be your machine, your boat could be your animal, your boat could be your mind, or whatever you want. And the control mechanism, the steersman is trying to keep it sort of steady and on course. And the steersman really doesn't have complete control. It's a regulative system, right? That's the magic word. It's a system that's being controlled by some sort of, we'll call it a feedback loop eventually, but for now we can just call it a sort of controlling the ship.
The paradigmatic example of a cybernetic machine that everybody has or knows about, presumably.
In your house?
Where is it in your house?
I guess are they? They're not in the boiler room, but that's where they're connected to, I guess.
Right, the furnace room, and that's your thermostat. Did I say thermostat, or did you just already know what I was talking about?
I knew that. I know that that's the archetype example of a cybernetic machine is a thermostat.
All right. So when we're talking about cybernetic machine, what a thermostat does is have a little temperature thermometer inside of it. When the air around it is cooler than the temperature you've set it to, then it turns on your furnace in your basement until the temperature through feedback makes this thermometer. They used to have these old like little ball bearings inside the thermometers. I'm sure now they're all digital. But as soon as the temperature reaches a certain point, whatever you've set it to, mine's at 23 degrees Celsius. And no, I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. But then it turns off the furnace until the temperature drops again. Then it will automatically turn on. And your thermostat does this all day long, automatically. And it's self-regulating. So you don't need to sit there and, throw more coal into the fire because it's automatically governed, you might say. So that would be the sense of a governor.
Yeah, and the more general term you might encounter for a thermostat would be like a homeostat. A cybernetic machine is a homeostat, meaning it likes to stay at a stable state. So if you set your temperature, you set the cutoff at like, say, you want to keep it at 23. So if your temperature goes up above 23, it shuts the furnace off. There's a mechanism in there that turns it off. And then presuming you have the heat on because it's cold outside, the temperature will cool down, and once it drops below a certain point, it'll flip back on again. And then that way it maintains a sort of homeostasis, you'd call it, like a stable, steady state. Think again of your boat going along the river, the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, the Greeks steering, and a wave knocks them off course. So the steersman, being the thermostat of the boat in this metaphor, has to correct the course of the boat, and by probably moving the rudder a little further than he had it before, and then the boat corrects and he moves the rudder back to the middle again, and where all the soldiers are happy on their way to rape and pillage the Ionian coast or wherever they're going.
Right. And the whole idea about this, about a cybernetic mechanism, is that it auto-corrects. You don't need to infer something like conscious thought and to explain a thermostat. All of this happens automatically. And you can see where the connection to biology is. Why don't we just jump into that first? Because this is where we broach systems theory. You have a lot of these systems in your body. For example, you get hungry. You get hungry, you don't have to consciously think about what that means. That means you need to go scrounge for food. You scrounge for food, your body tells you you're full, and that you can stop eating. That would be a cybernetic mechanism inside a larger system.
Yeah. I can also embarrass myself by not knowing what those things in your ear are called when you're off, that they help you maintain balance. Like, because when you have an ear infection, it's really hard to balance. So it's like your balancing mechanism in your ears are off. I don't even know if these are good examples anyway. I was going to say when I get too drunk, my brain just shuts off because it's like, all right, that's enough alcohol. And then you pass out, right? I don't know if maybe that's a good example. I mean, organisms are extremely complex, right? Like if you want to try and model like a single-celled organism, that is like even a really, really complicated. I don't even think we have enough computer data to model like a couple hours of what a cell can do. Never mind like an entire human being. So on the like mathematical precision side, organisms, you just can't deal with them in any precise ways. But yeah, these complex organisms like humans and dogs and cats and all kinds of animals, like they are also cybernetic. They just have 3 billion years of evolution behind them, whereas most of our machines are only 100 or 200 years old. I guess Stafford Beer says the first cybernetic machine was probably like a Watts engine.
Yeah, so this is not what a system is, by the way. These are kind of mechanisms, but they go into describing systems more generally. So systems more generally are used by systems theorists very specifically to mean a certain number of things and not certain other things. And a very important part of this is what we're calling this auto-correction. They need to be able to correct by changing the environment, which excludes certain things from being systems, of course. So rocks are not systems. Animals are. The solar system is not a system because it doesn't change its environment in order to, perpetuate itself, whereas human language is a system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so this sort of, I guess you could say systems thinking is a maybe I don't know, would you call it maybe a paradigm? I mean, in this sort of article I read to prepare by Andrew Pickering, he points out that cybernetics is almost like a paradigm shift. Like when we're saying paradigm shift, like think like Thomas Kuhn paradigm shift, or well, he describes it, but Galileo does it, right? He shifts the paradigm. And now we're shifting the paradigm again into this cybernetic systems theoretic paradigm. It's a kind of a new way of looking at the world. So instead of focusing on correctly representing things, like Newtonian science is a representational system, right? You just get it right, get the descriptions right, get the mathematical descriptions right, and you have a perfect mirror of nature in your textbooks or wherever. Whereas with this, it's more engaged, right? You're doing things in the world. You're looking at the world as active, as, I don't know if this is a word, agential, filled with agency.
Agentic, I think. And it's important to note that agency obviously preceded systems theory, but it was always thought of as being connected to consciousness or human beings specifically, or God, I guess. But this shifts the emphasis to, I guess, the automatic action of non-human actors.
Yeah, and I was also going to say, when you think of systems as well, I mean, you wouldn't be totally wrong to go back to German idealism and think of the systematic philosophers and the sorts of ways they start looking at things, like especially Hegel, right, who we've done episodes on already. We didn't focus on him from this angle, but you could. You could talk about him as a systems builder. He tries to build a system and fit everything into that system, right, where everything is interconnected, everything is related, everything is based on, instead of like positivist descriptions of what's out there in the world, it's based on distinctions within the system, right? So you start at a certain point, like sort of with everything and nothing at the same time, which is where he starts in the logic book, with being and nothing, and then you make that initial distinction. And that's when a system sort of comes into being. A system is distinguished from its background. And so you wouldn't be wrong to think about the systems philosophers in this German tradition. But it certainly takes on a new life in the middle of the 20th century, which is where like the story of cybernetics properly begins, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and when you're talking about a system, one of the defining features of it in this context is that a system is preparing itself to receive new information from the environment. And this could be, as you just mentioned, Eric, sort of an idea might be an example of new information. So when you talk about system building philosophy, what they're trying to do is be able to anticipate what new kinds of information might become that their system has to take account of. And it's a little bit of a loose example, but you can think more directly about your body, for example. Your body receives information from the environment in the form of heat, say, and when your body gets hot, it has a automatic mechanism to deal with that, which is that you sweat. So you sweat, the water evaporates, this cools off your skin, and then you stop sweating when you return to the word you mentioned earlier, which is homeostasis.
Yeah, you could think of the heat of the environment as the input, your body as the sort of system, and sweat as the output in that sort of, like, because the input-output model was sort of where it all began. I mean, this story gets a little complicated when we get to Autopoiesis, and I don't know if we'll be able to do it justice because there's some pretty subtle shit going on with these guys. But yeah, the input-output model and the machine learning sort of model is kind of where it all started. Like I would also give the example that Norbert Wiener, who we've already mentioned, who coins this term and gives this whole way of thinking its name, cybernetics. He was, I mean, this is going to give it all a very horrible military feeling, and it's not that, but he was working on an automatic air gun, right? A gun that'll shoot down planes. And so in this sense, you need something called feedback. So information being fed back into the system. So for instance, you'd have a gun connected to a servo mechanism, and you'd have a radar system that tracks a plane. And as the plane moves, the radar feeds the information into the machine. The machine and its algorithms, right, it processes that information in order to make predictions about where the plane will be in a couple seconds. It takes 12 seconds, for instance, for a shell to reach a plane in the sky. So it will move the servo mechanism, and it's an anti-aircraft predictor gun, right? And this is the idea, I think, for Norbert Wiener, where this whole approach was born. So you need that constant feed of information into the system, where the plane is. So if the plane changes direction, the radar picks that up. The feedback mechanism, which feeds the information back into the algorithms of the system, will then make new predictions and correct the gun's position, and that's sort of ongoing. So if the plane went off the radar, the gun wouldn't be receiving any more information. It wouldn't know where to shoot. It would just stop moving. So that's just another example. Lots of examples, they help.
Anyway, I wanted to get back a little bit onto track of what we're talking about in terms of systems. Communication, as you've heard, is very important. And the reason that systems theory can be applied to something like, we have an election there is a very large global election coming up. And this you could use it to describe a political system in which the goal of the system is to maintain itself. It's actually to prevent change, or at least large changes. And every system is trying to keep change as incremental as possible and to respond to what might be system damaging events that occur to it. And this is kind of where we cross over into things like the legal system, which is based on precedents, or computer systems, and the way that the online communication functions. So really, they're about adaptation. Is one of the biggest or most accessible words we could use to describe this. So whether it's an economic system, whether it's a biological system, whether it's your own body, these things want to continue, and they want to adapt to changes so that they can continue.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. The goal to, you could also say, their goal is to exist. Their goal is to perpetuate their own existence, especially when it comes to organisms, right? Like their goal is to, keep existing and eventually reproduce and pass on the genes to a new generation. And so living systems are very much, but also social systems, legal systems, even your psyche, right? Your brain is a psychological system that's connected to other systems around it, your body, your nervous system, all the other systems of the body. And their goal is to, either you could say maintain themselves, stay the same, or, stay in existence, to perpetuate.
Yeah, I'd like to make the transition to post-humanism also, because it tends to be a post-human area of research. And the reasons for that, actually, I'll kick it to you to explain that in a second. One thing that we haven't yet mentioned, but it's very important to systems theory, that includes cybernetics in this case, but systems theory is about observation. So for a systems theorist, it depends very much on where you're drawing the lines of a system that you're observing, which is called second order observation. I think we could do an entire hour on just second order observation. But this means that the system is where you, as the observer, draw the lines for it. So just as you could draw a line around an individual cell and say, this is the one cell that we are now talking about, you could just as easily draw a circle around the entire organism and say, okay, now we're talking about an organism. And you can go further up, say, no, we're talking about a species and a species' ability to evolve and adapt. And if they don't adapt, of course, they go extinct. Or if things happen in their environment too quickly, they go extinct. Or you could talk about life itself as a system. So really what you're looking at, or what you get out of observing the type of communication that's occurring, really depends on where you as the theorist are drawing the line around the system. So the position of the observer becomes extremely important in systems theory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is really, when I said that cybernetics represents a paradigm shift, well, this is actually, now that we've brought this up, we can even be even more specific, is that the real paradigm shift does happen when we start talking about observers, right? Because when I talked about the classical Newtonian model, right, the observer in that model is outside the system, right? They're not part of the system. Like this is how even this view persists in the sciences today. If you go into a sort of science course, and of course you're taught Newtonian mechanics, and then you're thrown in that sort of Einsteinian wrench into the whole system, but really like all your observations are fine at a sort of medium level. So when we talk about the transition to second order cybernetics, which gets going in probably by the end of the 50s, soon after, we're talking about the observer as being part of the system that is being observed, right? Like you've heard that, you've probably heard that saying where you can't observe something without changing it. What's that called? There's actually a term for that from anthropology, but it's also in quantum mechanics as well. You cannot observe a quantum state. You can't measure a quantum state without actually like affecting that quantum state, right? So the observer and by extension, the tools that the observer uses to measure the state of the system that they're interested in, whether it's psychological or material or social, they are considered to be a part of that system, to be not separated from it. Because before, right, it's that view from nowhere. It's that God trick. This is where Haraway comes back in because she coins this. It's the God trick where you remove your subjectivity and you're just a pure, objective, observing being. You're God, basically, observing the system from the outside.
The second order observation, you do have to include your own position in the schematic, we could say.
Yeah.
And this is getting us to the big kicker, the big point, and that is the observer is, in systems theory, not a human, or not necessarily a human. It's not conscious or not necessarily conscious. Systems observe each other variously. Even cells bumping into each other or exchanging fluids is a type of communication that could be called observation, because they're making decisions about their environment. So the big reveal here, about 40 minutes through, is that this is a post-human system. And we're not talking from the view of systems theory, there's no need for even giving intention or agency or the will of a person priority over any other type of will, over automatic wills, you could say. So one of the main systems theorists that we're probably going to be talking about is Niklas Lumen, who's a German sociologist. And for him, there is no such thing as humans. Humans are three overlapping systems that we kind of confuse as one thing because they happen to walk around as one thing. But your body is only one system. The other systems there are communication and the psyche. But this is where systems theory branches into a lot of philosophy that probably we're familiar with. Deleuze, for example, there's a lot of systems theory notions in Deleuzian philosophy. And I want to kick it back to one of the guys that you know really well, Eric, is Bateson, who Deleuze and Guattari read extensively. And Bateson is one of the original crew of systems theory thinkers.
Yes, he was one of the main forces behind this shift to the sort of second order systems theory by applying cybernetic thinking to the mind, to consciousness, to this idea you might have heard of the what do we call it, like extended cognition, the way that thought isn't just localized in the brain, but it takes place in an embodied system, and say that a mind is an extension of the brain. But, just to drop some Deleuze on you as a treat, Deleuze gets the idea of plateaus from Bateson, which is like how does he say it? It's a I actually have the quote right here. Yeah, Gregory Bateson uses the word plateau to designate something special, a continuous, self-vibrating region of intensities whose development avoids any orientation towards a culmination point or external end. So when you're reading 1,000 Plateaus, you can thank Bateson for that concept of the plateau, although Deleuze does things to it. Deleuze and Guattari have their way with it, as they do with concepts. But yeah, plateaus and the embodied extended mind sort of come from maybe cybernetics and Bateson. I don't know, maybe you'd agree with that.
I don't know, and because I don't know, I will not comment on it before exploring it further. But if you've been tracking, I don't actually know how well we've been doing this until I listen to it back, which is to observe the system at a second order. But systems are processes, so this fits in with process philosophy, which we discussed before. And they try to perpetuate themselves in time by adaptation. Now, we're going to get into a whole bunch of specific terminology, but one of the more difficult things to grasp about this is that systems do not directly interact. Any system, by definition, is a closed system, meaning that it draws a distinction between itself and its environment. So, this is going to be counterintuitive, and we'll probably do an episode on it, but your language and your mind do not ever directly interact. They're separate systems, and they kind of bump into each other in what's called a structural coupling, but they don't actually ever interact directly, in that they don't affect each other's processes, which sounds counterintuitive, but I'm kind of giving you the highlights of what's interesting in here and new ways of thinking, paradigm shifts.
So this idea of closure is I'll just focus on Nicholas Lumen. So Nicholas Lumen reads these two Chilean biologists named Maturana and Varela, Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, and they write a book called Autopoiesis and Cognition, the realization of the living, where they make a distinction between organization and structure. And the idea is that systems are organizationally closed, but they can be what you would say sort of causally open. So again, going back to the brain is organizationally closed. It uses its own sort of, it has its own, I don't know what you'd call it, like a material. It has its own sort of, it has its closed communicational loops within it, and it's closed off from the outside world. It's a unity, as you'd say, but structurally it is open, like it's causally open. So the fact that if you cut somebody's head off, their brain will stop working. It's open to causes that are coming in from the outside, but in terms of its functioning and its understanding of itself, and it's making distinctions between itself, like it's referring to itself, what we would call autoreferential, and it's referring to something outside of itself, it's sort of other reference. That all comes from the organizational closure aspect. So that's really, really important to say. So structural coupling is the idea that the structure in which the organization is embodied, the organization is sort of this relational structure, you could think of it, whereas the structure part is the concrete structure. And that's open in a way that it's, well, you just said it, it's structurally coupled to other systems around it. So what you would call perturbations, it will receive perturbations from the quote-unquote outside, and it will then, what would you say? It compensates within itself. It compensates for those perturbations by, again, drawing further distinctions. You know, again, going back to the thermostat, right? The thermostat isn't directly seeing the temperature of your house. It's structurally coupled in ways that make it sensitive to the temperature in your house. But what we would call that is a perturbation. When it cools down or heats up too much, it perturbs the system, and the system then compensates for those perturbances. But organizationally, it is closed. You don't directly observe the outside world. You can only really observe yourself and make distinctions between your inside and what's outside of you. You can only make those distinctions from within this sort of organizational closure. So it's a difficult sort of non-intuitive concept, but this is where Lumen gets it from, is Maturana and Varela making this distinction between organization and structure. So you have organizational closure, but you have a kind of causal openness expressed by the term structural coupling and perturbations.
Right. The system itself is closed, but then it gets, you use perturbation, which is interesting because I always use the word irritant, but they mean exactly the same thing, of course. But there's a reason that you can't see if you were to shine a light on your brain, right? Because you need the eye. The eye is the kind of machine that is structurally coupled to your brain, also a machine. These are the Deleuze words for it, of course, or system. But the purpose of the eye is to convert information, which are, photons that hit the back of your eye. And then that converts those into the electrical signals. I don't know how this works, by the way, but it converts it into electrical signals, which is a language that your brain understands. Your brain doesn't understand light, but the eye can convert the light into the electric shit that your brain understands.
Yeah. So this is why, for instance, like psychologists can't directly observe the contents of anybody's mind, right? Because the mind is it's a closed unity. You can't directly observe it. You have to come up with strategies. You have to, again, come up with strategies to experiment and perturb and test. And this is why we learn so much from things like brain damage, where we learn about lost functions. We learn negatively almost. We learn, like, if somebody has a condition called aphasia because their brain is damaged on a certain part, either Broca's area or Wernicke's area or whatever, you get this type of aphasia. And then we know what aphasia is based on what that person can no longer do. Maybe they can no longer string sentences together properly, or they can no longer sort of speak. Like, you get this kind of aphasia. So we learn things negatively in that sense because, as Cybernetics says, you can't directly observe the contents of another system. You structurally couple with that system in certain ways. So yeah, that cashes out in neurology and psychology as being like you have to do experiments on the subject. You have to, ask them questions and get them to exhibit behaviors. You have to elicit reactions.
Right. When you're in a psychoanalyst office, that's a perfect example of both second order observation and a system. And the system that you're trying to observe, but you can't, is the mind. But because you, as the psychoanalyst, understand language, you can use your language to bring back the analysand's language, so to speak, bring it back to your mind and then process that as information that your mind understands. So there's basically three closed systems here: the mind under observation, the language being passed between them, and then the observer, in this case, the therapist's mind. And as an observer in this case, this is a direct example of a system that you can't observe without it being affected, because necessarily when you're speaking to somebody, you're affecting their mind. But the idea is that they're operationally closed, and you're, again, just with the light example, your brain has to convert these sounds into something that makes sense. And Lumen uses the same word as Husserl for this, actually. Sin. Is that right? How do you pronounce sin?
Sinn. It's like meaning, right? Or sense.
SIN in German, but that's what gives you the cohesive picture, which is a form of closure. And to observe, you can't observe someone else's mind unless you keep talking to them and keep irritating it or perturbing it. And that's how you get information about a system that is closed.
Yeah, and so this is kind of the reason why, like the way that what I was saying before, that kind of view from nowhere type of science, where they want to make like a model of the mind, like it's never going to happen because you can't represent, which is probably just another way of saying like observe in the first order sense. You can't represent another system directly through whatever you want, computer modeling, right? You'll never get a computer model of a mind because you can't directly observe a mind. You can only observe it through these perturbations, as we were saying. So when I say like something is organizationally closed, and I say it has its own sort of material that it operates on itself in a way in order to process differences. And so for like a political system, for example, its material is power and legitimacy. For a social system, its material, again in quotes, is communications. And you could say the same thing, like the psychological system and the material biological system.
Right.
They're all sorts of interlocking.
They're connected, and each of them deals with a different type of information too, right? So the political system dealing with power is kind of an observation, but they make distinctions about what power means. Power is this and not that. A good example would be the legal system also, because the legal system makes distinctions between what is legal and non-legal. And it's not like you just write the law and now you know what's legal and non-legal. That's what the whole court system is for. And this is a system in the system sense, trying to determine which types of input, which types of cases would be its information, which are legal and which are non-legal. So that it's making distinctions to continue existing.
Yeah, so that's a great point for a social cybernetics perspective, right? Is that the legal system and the economic system and the political system, they're all sorts of separate systems. They don't touch each other. They don't have anything to do with each other in the cybernetic sense. Like each system has that organizational closure, right? Economics operates on money, right? Legal systems operate on right, like legitimizing certain laws, right? So they can intervene in one another, obviously, but that usually creates problems rather than solutions, right? Like if one system starts operating to an excess and generating problems for other systems, then you have to look at, well, what's going on, say, in the economy, because it's affecting these other systems.
Yeah.
But they're like from a theoretical standpoint, they exhibit that organizational closure just the same.
Right.
And that's what, like, Lumen's going to take that out and of Maturin and Varela. He's going to get rid of the sort of biological reductionism going on there, because they're only really talking about, they're biologists, so obviously. And he's going to try to apply them to different kinds of social systems. So again, the same principle of self-organization, self-reference, closure. All of these things are going to apply, and it makes Niklas Luhmann's sort of theory really very interesting. And I always say it's an interesting alternative to someone like Habermas or even Bruno Latour or even Foucault, who all have their own sorts of social theories. Luhmann's really stands out in being influenced by systems theory in a certain way.
And Lumen gained his early notoriety as a critic of Habermas, actually. And then Habermas said that Lumen had this like technocratic functionalism that undermined the possibility of like an emancipatory politics. But if you see this from Luhmann's perspective, like, I mean, the crude Marxist or neo-Marxist critique is like power is money in capitalism. And the problem is that's like not true. There's two separate systems. One is the exchange of currency and one is the exchange of power. So in order to get from one to the other, it's not just that you have money and then you also have power at the same time, right? You have to go out and deploy that money in a certain way by, for example, donating to a gubernatorial campaign or something like that. So that exchange is the structural coupling between the two systems, but it's very focused on what are we observing at any given time. And this is an example of two structural couplings which are very close. But Habermas didn't like that Luhmann like made this into all of his writing, basically, because there's not really room for a free or an emancipatory humanist ethics in here. Because for Luhmann, ethics is just hopeless in dealing with the complexity of post-industrial society. Like what you want to believe to be true doesn't matter at all. And what Luhmann was much more concerned with was how do we observe this in its full glory. But when you are observing as a theorist, when we are doing theory, then you always have to create a simplified model of the thing that you're observing. And that's another point that has to do with this second order, is that you can never, there's nothing more complicated than the system itself. Any representation of that is always going to be oversimplified. But he was very focused on like, don't say money is power, because it isn't. There's an exchange happening there, and there's not like two essences that are just fundamentally connected or something like that.
Yeah, or even in the way people sort of caricature Foucault as repeating that old Bacon dictum of knowledge is power. Well, no, knowledge is a function of different systems, right? Of science and institutions and academic systems, right? Whereas power is more associated with legal and political systems. So you can't really say one is the other. That would be reductive, and I don't even think Foucault actually says that in that caricatured way. But I would definitely, when looking forward to some kind of debate between this kind of perspective and perhaps the more democratic socialist perspective that Matt and Victor propound, I would definitely mine Lumen's critiques of Habermas, and especially Habermas's theory of communicative action, which really sort of turns on generating some kind of consensus before action can take place. I would definitely Lumen dismisses consensus as an important aspect, I would say, of action in a society. I think he has a whole different sort of way of looking at it, and I would definitely mind that a little bit if we're gonna load up our guns and come to that debate, if and when it happens.
Oh, it's got to happen. That was what our patrons voted. That was the second most highest voted, was us to have a debate over these lines, I think. And yeah, like just to simplify, like Lumen's criticism is like something like consensus is just too difficult when you're dealing with the complexities of highly differentiated societies. Because, consensus about what? About money? Well, that's one whole area that you would have to endlessly you have to understand it properly before you could institute anything. And then power is a completely different system that you have to understand. And then, something as banal as who needs to own cars in a post-industrial society. All of these things are going to factor in to the point where you can't just say, well, if we agree on what we believe, then that will make our beliefs take or establish themselves as changes in the world. Mm-hmm. Lumen's world is very difficult to change. And I think the world is very difficult to change. So hoping for something like revolution is so difficult and almost never happens. Mm-hmm. And systems theory is good at explaining that. And the quick definition here that why revolution is so difficult to make happen is because every single system is trying to perpetuate itself to not revolt. And this means that they're adjusting, they're like taking note of the conditions around them, unconsciously, of course, but they're taking note of the conditions and trying to adjust those conditions so that they can't be overthrown in that kind of way.
Yeah, and there's definitely a contradiction between the way Lumen sees the social system working and Habermas's sort of theory of rational communicative action. Is that, like, if a consensus ever really actually happened in a social system, the system would stop working.
It would just be done. It would be finished.
Yeah, that would be it, because it's not the system thrives on. Well, there's a distinction here to be made, because there's this legacy of Marxism where there's contradictions within a capitalist system and they need to be overcome. And for them, overcome is really just sweeping it under the rug, because those contradictions, those conflicts, are almost what the system is generating as part of its own activity, right? Like a distinction. What's another way to talk about a distinction where you divide one thing into one thing and another into another, right? Then they're in conflict with one another. They're contradictory in a certain sense of the word. And so the legacy of Marxism that Habermas sort of takes up and waters down quite a bit with his own theories is that we need to get over these conflicts and contradictions and reach a consensus in order to act. Whereas, Lumen would just say that's just skirting the issue, because that's not how social systems actually work.
Yeah, and we're to be fair, we're bastardizing Habermas a lot by saying that. But an example, a real world example, is the Latin language, because Latin was attempted to be purged of like local dialects. They wanted to make it basically the holy religion of Christianity, this ecclesiastical Latin, and in the process completed it, but killed it. Because as soon as you're finished, as soon as you say we're like this is what now Latin is, and you don't permit it to adapt anymore, then no one's going to use it, because the world is always changing. It's always receiving new information. And like technically, that's not exactly what happened. Latin evolved into all of the Romance languages, but ecclesiastical Latin is not spoken because they tried to perfect it, basically.
Yeah, it's a dead language, right? Yeah, and I just even maybe another like pedestrian point would be that yeah, all those differences, right? Systems are difference generating machines, and so all those differences between the local dialects are what sort of make the system work. That's the material on which the system sort of operates and generates and feeds back into itself. So you need those differences, right? This view of difference as being information. Like this is the famous line from Gregory Bateson, right? Information is a difference that makes a difference. When you reach a consensus, it's almost like a difference. Now you have a difference that doesn't make a difference because everyone agrees. That's a sort of very general way to put it.
To create differences is what's necessary for any type of, evolution, any type of growth. And what does evolution, or what does evolving, are our systems. Rocks don't evolve. The solar system doesn't evolve. But species evolve, languages evolve, economies evolve. So evolution is a very important part of what makes a system a system.
Yeah, and it's a view of like the dynamic nature of the material world, like the non-human world. It's a view that it's dynamic. It also generates its own differences. So it's not this sort of static world where humans are the agents and everything else is this dead stuff that we operate on. That's again kind of going back to the scientific view. But I mean, in certain way, like Habermas doesn't get away from that completely, or at least not to Lumen's satisfaction anyway. That would be like a whole episode just to describe that sort of thing. But yeah, you need the difference that makes a difference. That's an important sort of line in cybernetics. Differences make a difference for some observer, and the observer is again going to be another autopoietic system, making observations, drawing distinctions, and creating differences in its own system in order to compensate for the distinctions it draws, or it thinks it's drawing, right? There's always the chance that you misinterpret something.
Right.
That's another fun thing about communication, is that the chance for miscommunication is always there. It's never going to go away. And so consensus is kind of an ideal speaking situation where everyone reaches a consensus, we all agree, deliberative democracy works, and life is better for everyone. Well, I mean, that doesn't seem to be happening. It's a nice theory, and not to say that Habermas is a bad thinker. He's one of the best, but we're taking sides here, so we're gonna shit on him a little bit. We're gonna take swings.
Yeah,
and because Matt loves Habermas quite a bit, so fuck that guy.
And theory is a rendering of the world. That's another important thing. Like theory is not a knowledge of the world; it's a vision of a world, so to speak. So that's why there's always a capacity for growth, because the world's always changing. So you can never have a totalized system. And I guess we could reference Kant here, because unlike someone like Kant, systems theory turns away from the knowing subject, like the conscious subject, to reality that's consisted of these multiple self-referential systems, and they are all observing each other. There's not like a special observer, which is something that you opened up with here, because the observations of systems theory are situated in the world that they're also interested in. They're made of the same stuff. So I've been reading a lot of Deleuze lately. We have this concept of univocity. And systems theory does not, it appears to break with that univocity because it makes representations of the things that it's talking about. Like you and I, Eric, are creating a version of a legal system here just by speaking about it that may or may not correspond to the real legal system. We're creating a rendering for it in the minds of our listeners here. But then the Kantian question of how can a subject have objective knowledge is just gone. And then the question is, how can you organize this complexity? Because you're never going to have full knowledge. It's impossible. You're in the world, and your knowledge is in the world that is always changing.
Yeah, and I think from a cybernetic point of view, that Kant's thing in itself would almost be is like the way Kant sort of tries to bring in the outside world into the system, like to sort of account for it in his philosophical system, but it just becomes a kind of black hole. It's the thing in itself. You can never know the thing in itself. So once we get to Hegel and then modern systems theory, right, we get rid of that thing in itself and we accept the fact that there's a kind of organizational closure, and that's the perspective of the observer, and we don't need to talk about a thing in itself in this sense. Like Kant almost like made a mistake and discovered something great when he talks about a thing in itself.
Yeah. But the thing in itself, it does exist, but it only exists inside Kant's system. It doesn't necessarily exist outside of it. So it's reality, and reality is what resists, right? That's all reality can be, is something that resists, right? Like everyone they want to get rid of it in the wrong way. Like they want to get rid of it in the way, like say structuralism and postmodernism want to get rid of it by just talking about concepts paired with linguistic signifiers, right? They want to get rid of the outside world completely. Well, we don't want to do that, but we also don't want a thing in itself. Right.
So we say, the thing in itself is reality. It's what resists. It's the thing you got to go out and you just got to do things. And if they don't work, then that's the resistance there. And if they do work, well, that's you sort of overcoming the resistance. And in that process, you draw another distinction. Or you draw out the recipe for doing that thing. Right. You draw out the algorithm, and you can do it again in the future.
And you create new differences that are going to come back to affect your observations later.
Yeah, like we're never going to pull the veil up on the thing in itself. We're never going to sneak up on it from behind, as Hegel says, or step outside of ourselves in order to see it. But it's just simply what resists. It's the source of why we adopt an experimental model when it comes to science, is because you got to go out there and you got to test nature and you got to poke and prod it. Or if you want to take, again, going back to Bacon and his horrible sexist sort of language, saying like nature is a woman and you got to torture her to get her secrets. Well, I mean, the way he said it is wrong, but the meaning is kind of correct, I guess.
And the reason that systems theory is the best one is because you can also have a systems theory of systems theory. Like there's not levels of reality here. There's not like a division between mind and body, because systems theory is itself developing a system, and it simulates complexity as its explanation. So it doesn't suffer from that problem of not understanding its own self-referentiality, which is often the problem that philosophy falls into. Systems theory is the object and the observer of social systems both at the same time. So there's a self-referential circle in there.
Right.
And unlike a lot of what I've talked about before in terms of semiotics, and maybe I don't know if you'll agree with this or not, because you know that a lot better than I do, but systems theory is looking for a general direction of differentiation that's not concerned with language specifically as the one example of self-referentiality. For systems theory, every system is self-referential in a different way, not just language. Language doesn't create a whole new, well, it does actually. Language creates a whole new world, But it's it's connected with the world that it's responding to, and that's why it changes over time. But law does the same thing, right? Law is not like a divine gift of God that never changes. Law, to be functional, has to change with every case. And the same thing goes for your body.
Yeah, language is a little difficult. Like in Lumen's system, for social systems, like language is communication, really. And like communication isn't just linguistic. It can be nonverbal. There's all kinds of different communications. Like what semiotics, or what I would call semiology, does is it takes linguistics as the exemplary system on which all other systems are modeled.
Right.
And almost in a way, all the other systems become embedded. So then, like, you get this sort of linguistic turn where you have this, like, language creates reality point of view. And, like, okay, that's a little bit right, but we're not sort of all the way there, because now we've just taken out external reality and, like, other kinds of communication that are non-linguistic. And I think Deleuze sort of sees this, too, because we spoke about Lumen's division of the psychic, the biological, and the social. Well, like Deleuze kind of has that same sort of division. He has those 3 clusters of strata he talks about in his geophilosophy, which is the material strata, where, you know, the crystalline strata and the geological strata, and then you have the next one, the organic strata, where you have the biological stuff happening, right? You have genes, you have folding. Yeah. You have all that stuff. And then you have the third one, which is the sort of the human tool-using, language-using, what he calls alloplastic strata, right, which is the third. So you have that, you have this 3-way division. Deleuze takes it up. If you read later Guattari and his 3 ecologies, what do you get there? You get the material, the mental, and the environmental, or the material, the mental, and the social. You get all those, that sort of, again, these 3 interlocking, overlapping, but ultimately organizationally closed strata, which are actually clusters of strata. So there's other systems going on in there too. Like within the social system, you have institutions, you have interactions, you have all these other sorts of sub-systems, as I would call them.
And I don't mean to downplay the importance of language, because language is one of the most special systems that there is, and that's because it's so flexible. Like we could just invent a word here, whereas we couldn't invent, like, I don't know, an elementary particle here. But because we can just invent a word here and there kind of as we see fit, and then submit it to the group to be used or not used, it is the most flexible of all systems because of how much it can represent. And that's kind of one of the sources for humans' capacity to predict, control, manage, even into the future, control, manage, and predict. And why we are so good at creating our own environment is because we have such a flexible system at our disposal, which is language, and specifically written language, that you can store all of this knowledge as its own system. But when you're speaking, you're affecting language. You're not affecting the world in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I'd say that too, because like this language is still what distinguishes sort of humans from everything else. But I think this is another way to appreciate how unique it is. It's a more realistic way. It puts it in its place, I think, a little bit better in the grand scheme of things than a language centric kind of philosophy would.
Right, like bees communicate, of course, with pheromones and whatever, but you can't represent galaxies and pheromones, right? You need a highly complex language to be able to talk about something like a galaxy.
Yeah, and like language, you can still use symbols to connect to arbitrary meanings, which is a powerful sort of tool that language offers. But when you take that a little bit too far, it just kind of becomes like everything is arbitrary when you take that perspective. Like all of our values, all of our scientific concepts are all just arbitrary sorts of words mapped onto subjective concepts, right? Like you can go too far in that direction.
I mean, they are arbitrary, but they work still. And that's kind of the point of systems theory is, why does all this stuff work when it's not strictly speaking representative. And that's kind of what it explains, I think.
Yeah, I'd say so.
Like laws work. You can't deny that they don't work, but it doesn't mean that law is like a perfect observation. And this is why we would have debates about law on the pill pod generally.
Yeah, like I guess if laws weren't working, you would see some kind of runaway feedback, right? Like when we talk about feedback, you have those two types. So when I describe the gun, for example, like if the plane turns and the gun is no longer pointing at it, you need a negative feedback loop to reduce the sort of stimulation in the system. You bring it back to a normal state. And then the opposite is positive feedback, like what we're doing to the environment right now by putting all this carbon out into the atmosphere. What we're doing is we're creating positive feedback, where we're taking a system that was operating in relative stability, i.e. the carbon cycle, and we're introducing positive feedback loops into it. And we're going to create this that's how you talk about runaway climate change. That's what people are talking about when they're saying we're reaching tipping points, is we're creating runaway positive feedback loops. So you can sort of see when like laws and things aren't working, when they are sort of diverging away from a steady state. You could say the same thing about the economy too, probably, is that the capitalist economy creates these positive feedback loops by sort of making money the center of everything. Like they want to impose money onto law, and they want to impose money onto politics. So you get things like I don't know, unlimited campaign donations, for example. Like that could be an example of one system sort of perturbing another system to such a degree that it creates these runaway feedback loops. And eventually, what happens when feedback builds up in a system too much, it's no longer a unity. It can no longer reproduce the conditions that it wants in order to function normally. It's going to dissolve in a way. It's going to die in the biological language. Yeah. So like capitalism is killing our political system in a certain way, or Facebook is irritating our democratic, nicely working political system by introducing all of this information that's creating all of this sort of instability, right? We're no longer operating at a steady, stable state.
Yeah, just to summarize what you said, positive feedback says, oh, I got some, now I want more. And negative feedback says, okay, I have this pang or this warning, so then I need to return to equilibrium or homeostasis or a normal state. So imagine if you were eating and every time you took a bite, you got more hungry. Like eventually it wouldn't take very long and your stomach would explode. So that's kind of what when you're talking about either environmental change or capitalism, or any time you see like exponential growth, there's probably some sort of positive feedback happening. And the only thing that can end positive feedback is a crash, usually killing the system in question, or at least damaging it heavily in some way for a long time.
Yeah. Even going back to our little steersman guy, right? If a wave hits the boat and knocks it off course, right? The steersman has to introduce negative feedback to steady the ship once more and get it back on course, because the course, staying on course would be the metaphor here for a stable system. And so any waves or any kind of interference would create something that you need to correct through introducing negative feedback.
Yeah, when a wave hits the boat, you don't just keep steering the ship in the opposite direction. You steer it back the other way, which is why it's called negative feedback as opposed to positive feedback. Anyway, so Eric, if we do this for a couple weeks, what other topics do you think will come up? I'm thinking like comp sci. We could talk about social media in terms of like an information managing system, because that seems to produce positive feedback. Anything else you can think of as application or thinkers you want to discuss? We've mentioned a lot of them, but there's a lot to go.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we sort of just scratched over a lot of the surface of what's going on in cybernetics and systems theory, and yeah, and then now we can sort of zoom in a little more, maybe get a little closer to some of the thinkers in the tradition. If people are interested in say like Gregory Bateson or Nicholas Lumen, we can get a little closer to them. But we can also look at things like politics, social media.
I'd like to talk about attention specifically, because I think we have a stable homeostatic system in our mammalian brain, but then the amount of information that you're exposed to now almost becomes overwhelming. And when your brain breaks, it turns into stuff like anxiety disorder, maybe. There's links there, but you can give an entire systems theory analytic over top of those connections and say, okay, we have an explanatory mechanism here. That doesn't mean that the explanation is always right. We can do experiments, and I think that'd be fun. We could look at Marxism from a systems theory perspective, what parts of it would work and what parts of it wouldn't work. Because if you're talking about any sort of utopianism, which, by the way, I wouldn't align with Marxism without a whole bunch of qualifiers, but you couldn't have a classless society if it wasn't going to encounter new forms of difference that it would have to adjust to, because systems need an environment where difference comes from in order to feed them. So there's a lot of stuff we could talk about. I think we'll probably start with feedback and autopoiesis, which is how do systems encounter information and then incorporate them as differences inside them. And we'll use plenty of examples. I think we can pick up a few books. What do you think?
Yeah. I think the biological sort of approach is a good place to start and then build from there. How do we look at autopoiesis and, quote, non-living systems? I mean, Lumen makes the just this beautiful, simple argument of like, well, if autopoiesis is only for living systems, well, clearly like social systems and psychological systems have to have life too, right? If there was no life, there would be no society. If there's no life, there'd be no mind to speak of.
Yeah,
so we can start at the sort of biological level as well and work our way out from there.
Yeah, if you want to have like a philosophical tradition touchstone, I think like for me the closest is like Whitehead, because for Whitehead, doing an organic philosophy means that everything is in process, which is the same observation that systems theory makes, because it observes everything, society, law, people, bodies, all as processes. And the observation, takes precedence over trying to define what something is or structure what something is. You have to look at how something is, which I think is for me the most interesting part of philosophy.
Yeah, I wonder if there's not something interesting with Marx and his view of labor and sort of man in nature kind of view of labor as transforming nature. And there's some great parallels there between the way that humans transform the world through their labor and the way that organisms operate by sort of transforming their environment to be more like them in a certain way and to be more, conducive to further autopoietic operations, and get a little more into those dirty concepts of organization and structure and autopoiesis, and like dig into that. Like, what the heck is that? It's really a theory of unity, right? Like, how can something change over time, but also maintain its identity, right?
Yeah,
like
coherence.
Have an identity. Like this is what Descartes was thinking about in the Meditations. He was like, if I light this candle and then close my eyes and I open them a minute later and look at it, well, how do I know it's the same thing, right? Its smell has changed, its taste has changed, its feel has changed, everything has changed about it. So how can it maintain its identity through time? And of course, Descartes' answer has more to do with, well, concepts, ideas, and being a thinking thing. His dualism is his answer to it. But we got another answer.
Yeah,
so some of those things would be interesting to bring into play.
And of course, our podcast is a system as well that expends energy And if you want to come on this little conceptual journey with us, I'm tired of all the politics stuff. That's why we're going out of the politics to abstract observation. But if you want to join us on this journey and you're not yet a patron, become a patron today. And if you don't want to do that, then you can enjoy the rest of our free content that comes out pretty much every week.
Yeah, and the wolves are definitely hungry for Deleuze, so we can also look at how the way Deleuze engages with systems theory. He's definitely into systems biologists, Jacques Monod and other figures, Jakob von Uxküll. There's some interesting relations between balls.
Yeah, you could kind of think of difference in repetition as a sort of development of a systems theory thinking. It wouldn't be systems theory proper because it's metaphysical, but it creates a coherence.
Yeah, like that whole machine ontology they have, that's what you kind of call it, is like a machine ontology, machinic being. Yeah, like that really kind of comes into play with Matran and Varela too, living machines. They treat living organisms like a different kind of machine rather than something ontologically sort of distinct.
Yep, that'll be hype. So we're going to keep going with this. We would love it if you decided to come with us. If not, then we hope you got an interesting look at systems theory and maybe want to do some of your own research. We've been referencing Niklas Lumen a lot. He's the main thinker for sociological systems theory. Then Maturana and Varela, of course, are the biological systems theorists, usually where the term is first applied. And then cybernetics, we mentioned Norbert Wiener, and a few other things. So,
yeah, I love it. And maybe we can get to my my good old cyber semiotics too, where this all sort of comes together in biosemiotics as well. Soren Breyer's book. If you haven't heard of him, I'd look him up. But we should definitely get to that in some future world because I love semiotics.
Yeah, I love hearing you talk about that stuff, and I don't know anything about it. So, if we continue our little series here, then I would love to, interview you about that, ask you questions about cyber semiotics, biosemiotics, and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, perhaps when we talk about Derrida a little bit, or maybe we already did. I don't know when you're hearing this. Maybe we did already, but there's going to be, or is an episode on Derrida where I will go off on semiology a little bit.
All right. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, listener. We hope this was fun. We'll catch you later.
Bye for now.
Plastic pills out.
Oh. Yeah. Soundbite.